The voice recorder clicked off with a soft snap that echoed through my home office like a rupture. I sat there in the dark, staring at the small device that had just shattered my 20-year marriage into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You're not his toy anymore, Aaron," Maddie's voice had crackled through the speaker just moments before. "That coal-covered caveman doesn't deserve you. You need to set yourself free." My wife's laugh had followed. Bright, conspiratorial, nothing like the tired sighs I'd been getting at home. "You're right, I'm done pretending to be happy in this dump of a town." I'd planted that recorder in Erin's purse 3 days ago, after catching her deleting text messages and taking mysterious phone calls in the garage. Call it paranoia or instinct, but 20 years of marriage teaches you when something's rotting beneath the surface. The coal mine business had been good to us, real good. I'd built Blackstone mining from nothing, started with a shovel and a dream, worked my way up from the pit to the office. Now I employed half of Gray Ridge, West Virginia, and our bank account had more zeros than most folks in this dying town would see in a lifetime. But apparently, that wasn't enough for Aaron anymore. I rewound the recording and listened again to the part that made my insides turn to ice water. "Jackson's picking me up at 8 tomorrow," Aaron had whispered to her sister Trish. "Tell Mom I'm staying at your place if anyone asks." Jackson Price, that smooth-talking logistics coordinator from Aaron's company. I'd met him at the Christmas party last year, all teeth and handshakes, the kind of guy who called everyone buddy and wore cologne that cost more than my work boots. The front door creaked open downstairs. Aaron's heels clicked across our hardwood floors, the same floors I'd installed myself when we bought this house 15 years ago. "Honey?" she called out, her voice sugary sweet. "You still up?" I slipped the recorder into my desk drawer and flicked on the lamp. "Just finishing some paperwork." She appeared in the doorway, still wearing that black dress she'd claimed was for a girls' night out. Her makeup was smudged, and there was a hickey on her neck that she'd tried to cover with foundation. "How was your evening with the girls?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Oh, you know how it is. Maddie's still complaining about her divorce settlement, and Trish can't stop talking about her new boyfriend." She fidgeted with her wedding ring, the same ring I'd saved 6 months to buy when we were young and broke and stupid in love. "That's nice," I said. "Get home safe." She kissed my forehead, and I caught a whiff of unfamiliar cologne. Not the cheap stuff I wore, but something expensive and cloying. After she went upstairs, I sat in the dark for another hour, listening to her shower and wondering how long this had been going on. The woman I'd married wouldn't have lied to my face with such practiced ease. That Aaron had been honest to a fault, sometimes brutally so. This new version was a stranger wearing my wife's face. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our recent text conversations. Nothing but logistics, grocery lists, schedule confirmations, the mundane maintenance of a marriage running on autopilot. When had we stopped talking about real things? When had I become just another item on her to-do list? The next morning, I watched from the kitchen window as Erin loaded an overnight bag into her car. She told me she was spending the weekend at Trish's place, helping her sister redecorate after her recent breakup. But I knew better now. I waited until her car disappeared around the corner, then grabbed my keys and headed for the mine. Saturday mornings were usually quiet at the office, which made it the perfect time for planning. Blackstone Mining sat on 300 acres of scarred earth about 10 miles outside Gray Ridge. The main office was a converted double-wide trailer that I'd been promising to replace for 5 years. Inside, the walls were covered with safety charts, production reports, and photos from company picnics back when we all still pretended to be one big happy family. I fired up the coffee maker and spread out a map of the county on my desk. Jackson Price lived in Morgantown, about 40 miles east. There were 3 motels between here and there, all the kind of places that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions. My phone buzzed with a text from Big Joe, who owned the Lantern, the closest thing Gray Ridge had to a decent bar. "Saw your missus at the Roadside Inn last night. Thought you should know, the Roadside Inn. A fleabag motel on Route 19 that catered to truckers and cheating spouses. I'd driven past it 1,000 times and never given it a second thought." I texted back, "Thanks, Joe, I owe you one." "You don't owe me nothing, brother. Just take care of yourself." Big Joe had been my friend since high school, back when we were both dumb enough to think we'd escape Gray Ridge and make something of ourselves in the big city. He'd made it as far as Pittsburgh before a stint in county lockup convinced him to come home and take over his father's bar. I'd never left at all, but I had made something of myself, right here in this forgotten corner of Appalachia. I employed 63 people and pumped millions of dollars into the local economy every year. I'd earned respect the hard way, with calloused hands and an honest day's work. And now my wife was throwing it all away for some slick-haired pretty boy who probably couldn't change his own oil. I spent the rest of the morning going through personnel files, looking for any connection between my operation and Jackson Price. What I found made my jaw clench so hard I thought my teeth might crack. 3 months ago, we'd been hit with a surprise safety inspection that had cost us 2 weeks of production and $30,000 in fees. The inspector had known exactly where to look, like someone had given him a roadmap of our operation. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but it had come through the same regional office where Jackson worked. My wife hadn't just been cheating on me. She'd been feeding information to her boyfriend, helping him sabotage my business. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tiles, trying to process the magnitude of her betrayal. This wasn't just about love or romance or whatever fairy tale she'd convinced herself she was living. This was about destroying everything I'd built. The smart thing would have been to call a lawyer, file for divorce, and try to salvage what I could. But I'd never been accused of being smart. I was a coal miner's son who'd clawed his way up from nothing, and I'd learned early that sometimes you have to fight dirty to survive. If Erin wanted to play games, I'd teach her the rules. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I was nursing my second cup of coffee when Trish knocked on the back door. My sister-in-law was 5 years younger than Erin, with the same blonde hair but none of the polish. Where Erin had learned to smooth her rough edges, Trish still carried herself like the scrappy kid from the wrong side of Grey Ridge that she'd always been. "Morning, Danny," she said, letting herself into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. "Erin around? She's still at your place, isn't she?" I kept my voice neutral, curious to see how deep this conspiracy went. Trish's face flushed red. "Oh, right, of course. I left early this morning and wasn't sure if she was still sleeping." Strike one. If Erin had really spent the night at Trish's place, her sister would know whether she was still there. "Want some coffee?" I offered. "Sure." Trish settled into the chair across from me, the same spot where Erin used to sit when we'd plan our days over breakfast. Before she'd started making plans that didn't include me, I poured her a mug and studied her face. Trish had always been the wild one, the sister who'd gotten pregnant at 16 and married 3 different men before she turned 30. But she'd also been fiercely loyal to family, which made her presence here interesting. "You know," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "I've been thinking about what you said at Christmas." I hadn't said much of anything at Christmas, but I played along. "What's that?" "About how marriage takes work. How you have to fight for what matters." She looked up at me with eyes that were too knowing for comfort. "Sometimes I wonder if Erin remembers that." Strike two. Trish was fishing, trying to figure out what I knew. "Erin's going through a phase," I said carefully. "New job, new friends. She's trying to figure out who she wants to be." "Yeah, about those new friends." Trish pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos. "I was at Maddie's birthday party last week. Erin couldn't make it. Said she had to work late, but Maddie showed us some interesting pictures." She turned the phone toward me, and my blood turned to ice. The photo showed Erin and Jackson at some upscale restaurant in Morgantown. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that was way too intimate for business colleagues. "Maddie thinks it's hilarious," Trish continued. "She keeps saying Erin deserves better than being stuck in this dead-end town with a man who smells like coal dust." Strike three. But instead of anger, I felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. "How long have you known?" I asked. Trish's shoulders sagged with relief. "About 6 weeks. I tried to talk to her, Danny, I really did. But she's got it in her head that she's some kind of trapped princess, and Jackson's her knight in shining armor." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're family," she said simply. "And because Erin's making a mistake that's going to destroy everything good in her life." I studied my sister-in-law's face, looking for signs of deception. Trish had always been transparent to a fault. She couldn't lie to save her life, which had gotten her into trouble more times than I could count. "What do you want me to do about it?" I asked. "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But if you're planning something, I want to help. The smart thing would have been to send her home and handle this myself, but Trish had just handed me something more valuable than money. Information and an inside track to Erin's plans. "I might need someone to keep an eye on things," I said carefully. Let me know if Erin's planning any more overnight trips. Trish nodded eagerly. She's got another business conference next weekend in Charleston this time. Charleston was only 2 hours away, close enough for day trips if it was really about business. The overnight stay was just another lie in a growing collection. After Trish left, I sat in my kitchen and tried to figure out what game she was really playing. The obvious answer was that she genuinely cared about her sister and wanted to prevent a disaster. But Trish had always been jealous of Erin's success, her stable marriage, her comfortable life. Maybe she saw this as an opportunity to watch her perfect sister fall from grace. Or maybe she had her own agenda entirely. I spent the rest of the day working in my garage, tearing apart an old engine and trying to keep my hands busy while my mind raced. By evening, I'd come up with the skeleton of a plan. Erin wanted to play games? Fine. But she was about to learn that I'd been playing them longer and better than she ever imagined. The coal business had taught me patience. You don't rush into a mine shaft without checking for gas leaks and structural problems. You survey the terrain, identify the weak points, and then you dig carefully and methodically until you reach your target. Erin and Jackson had given me plenty of weak points to exploit. When my wife came home that evening, she was glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen from her in months. She chattered about her weekend with Trish, spinning elaborate stories about shopping trips and movie marathons that sounded rehearsed and hollow. I played the part of the oblivious husband, nodding in the right places and asking harmless questions about her fictional weekend. But inside, I was taking notes, cataloging every lie for future reference. "I'm thinking about taking that promotion they offered me," she said over dinner. "It would mean more travel, but the money's too good to pass up." The promotion was real. I'd heard her talking about it months ago. But I was willing to bet the sudden interest had more to do with spending time with Jackson than advancing her career. "That's great, honey," I said. "You've worked hard for this." She smiled and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Thanks for being so understanding. I know it's not easy having a wife who's never home anymore." The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. She was actually thanking me for making it easier for her to cheat. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and finalized my plans. Erin thought she was so clever, sneaking around behind my back while I played the role of the dumb, trusting husband. She had no idea what she'd unleashed. Monday morning found me at the Lantern before the sun came up, nursing a cup of coffee that could strip paint and waiting for Big Joe to finish his inventory. The bar looked different in the harsh fluorescent light, older, more worn around the edges. The neon beer signs were dark, and the jukebox sat silent in the corner like a sleeping giant. "You look like heck," Joe said, emerging from the back room with a clipboard and a frown. "When's the last time you slept?" "Sleep's overrated," I replied. "I need a favor." Joe poured himself a cup of coffee and settled onto the stool next to mine. At 52, he was built like a linebacker going to seed, with graying hair and knuckles scarred from his younger, stupider days. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that involves Jackson Price and a little public embarrassment." Joe's eyes lit up with interest. "I'm listening." I laid out the basics of my plan, keeping the details vague but the objective clear. Joe nodded along, occasionally asking questions about timing and logistics. "You sure about this?" he asked when I finished. "Once you start down this road, there's no going back." "I'm sure. What about Erin? You still love her?" The question caught me off guard. Did I still love my wife? Or was I just in love with the memory of who she used to be? "I love the woman I married," I said finally. "This person, she's become... I don't even know her anymore." Joe nodded like that made perfect sense. "When do you want to do this?" "Friday night. Jackson usually comes to town on Fridays for their little rendezvous. Consider it done." I spent the rest of the week laying groundwork, making phone calls, and setting pieces in motion. The beauty of living in a small town is that everyone knows everyone else's business. The downside is that everyone knows everyone else's business. By Wednesday, half of Grey Ridge had heard rumors about Erin's affair. I hadn't spread them directly, that would have been too obvious. Instead, I'd simply mentioned to a few key people that I was worried about my wife's long hours and frequent travel. In a town where gossip was the primary form of entertainment, that was all it took. Thursday evening, Trish called with an update. "Erin's planning to meet Jackson at the Lantern tomorrow night," she said. "She thinks it'll be more discreet than the motel." I almost laughed. The lantern was about as discreet as a billboard on Main Street. Did she say what time? Around 9. She's telling you she has to work late on a quarterly report. Thanks, Trish. I owe you. Just try not to hurt her too bad, okay? She's still my sister. Friday crawled by like a wounded animal. I went through the motions at work, reviewing safety reports and production schedules, but my mind was elsewhere. Several of my employees asked if I was feeling all right, and I realized I must have looked as distracted as I felt. At 7 o'clock, Erin called to tell me she'd be working late. Don't wait up, she said, her voice bright with anticipation. This report is going to take forever. No problem, honey. I might grab a beer at Joe's place anyway. That sounds nice. You should get out more. The casual dismissal in her voice was like a slap across the face. She was so eager to get rid of me that she didn't even bother to hide it anymore. I arrived at the Lantern at 8:30 and took a seat at the end of the bar where I could watch the door. Joe had briefed his staff on the plan, and everything was set. At 9:15, Erin walked in wearing a dress I'd never seen before and enough perfume to choke a horse. She looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable being in her husband's regular hangout. But she made her way to a corner booth anyway. Jackson arrived 10 minutes later, all smiles and swagger. He kissed Erin on the cheek and slid into the booth across from her, completely oblivious to the fact that half the bar was watching their every move. I nursed my beer and waited. The plan was simple. Let them get comfortable, maybe have a drink or two, and then make my presence known in the most embarrassing way possible. But as I watched them together, saw the way Erin laughed at Jackson's jokes, the way she leaned across the table to touch his hand, I felt something ugly and violent stirring in my chest. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming what was mine. At 10 o'clock, I stood up and walked over to their table. Evening, folks, I said, keeping my voice friendly and casual. Mind if I join you? Erin's face went white as a sheet. Jackson looked confused, like he couldn't quite process what was happening. Danny, Erin stammered, I thought you were... What are you doing here? Same thing as you, apparently. Having a drink with friends. I pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for an invitation. You must be Jackson. I'm Danny Morrison, Erin's husband. Jackson's confusion shifted to panic. Oh, hi. Erin was just... We were discussing a work project. At 9 o'clock on a Friday night? I signaled the waitress for another beer. Must be some project. The silence stretched out like a taut wire. Erin was staring at the table, her face flushed with embarrassment. Jackson kept glancing toward the door like he was calculating his chances of making a run for it. You know, I said conversationally, it's funny how small towns work. Someone sees something interesting, and within a few hours, everyone knows about it. Jackson's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Look, Mr. Morrison, I think there might be some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding at all, I interrupted. You're screwing my wife. She's lying to me about working late so she can meet you in cheap motels. The only question is what we're going to do about it. The entire bar had gone quiet. Even the jukebox seemed to sense the tension and switched to a slower, more ominous song. Erin finally looked up, her eyes blazing with a mixture of shame and defiance. Danny, please, not here. Why not here, I asked. This is where you chose to bring your boyfriend. Seems like the perfect place to discuss your relationship. Jackson started to stand up. I think I should go. Sit down, I said, and something in my voice made him comply immediately. We're not finished talking. I leaned back in my chair and studied the two of them. They looked like deer caught in headlights, frozen and terrified. Here's what's going to happen, I said quietly. Jackson, you're going to finish your drink, walk out that door, and never contact my wife again. Erin, you're going to come home with me so we can have a long overdue conversation about the future of our marriage. You can't just, Jackson started. Can't what? I stood up slowly, letting him see all 6 feet and 200 pounds of me. Can't protect my family, can't defend what's mine. Jackson's face had gone pale. He was probably 20 years younger than me, but he'd never done a day of hard labor in his life. His soft hands and manicured nails told the story of a man who'd never had to fight for anything. This is crazy, he muttered, but he was already reaching for his wallet. Crazy as thinking you could waltz into my town and steal my wife without consequences, I replied. Crazy is believing that actions don't have repercussions. Jackson threw a 20 on the table and headed for the door without another word. The entire bar watched him leave, and I knew the story would be all over Grey Ridge by morning. Erin was crying now, quiet tears that she tried to wipe away with her napkin. "Happy now?" she whispered. "Not even close," I said, "but it's a start." The ride home was silent, except for the sound of Erin's occasional sniffles and the steady thrum of my truck's engine. She sat pressed against the passenger door like she was afraid I might reach across and grab her. Maybe she was right to be afraid. When we pulled into our driveway, she finally spoke. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." I ended the engine and turned to face her. "The real question is how long you've been planning to make a fool of me." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "How was it supposed to happen, Erin? Were you planning to ask for a divorce? Or were you just going to keep sneaking around until someone else caught you?" "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Bees." The word came out harsher than I'd intended. "You've been feeding Jackson information about my business. That safety inspection that cost us $30,000? That came from his office." Her face went white. "Danny, I never..." "Never what? Never told your boyfriend about the safety violations you've been nagging me to fix for months? Never mentioned that we were cutting corners on the ventilation system?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Jesus Christ, Erin. I could have lost everything. My business, my reputation, the jobs of 63 people who depend on me." "I was trying to protect those people," she said, finally looking at me directly. "Someone could have been ended because of those violations. So you went behind my back instead of talking to me about it? When was the last time you listened to anything I said?" Her voice was getting stronger, angrier. "When was the last time you cared about anything besides coal production and profit margins?" The accusation hit harder than I wanted to admit. When had I stopped listening to my wife? When had our conversations become nothing but logistics and small talk? "That doesn't justify what you did," I said. "No, it doesn't." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But it explains it." We sat in the truck for another few minutes, both of us staring at the house we'd shared for 15 years. In the porch light, it looked smaller somehow, less substantial than it had that morning. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know." It was the first honest thing either of us had said all evening. Inside, Erin went straight upstairs while I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in my office, staring at the voice recorder that had started this whole mess. My phone buzzed with a text from Trish. "Heard about what happened at Joe's. You okay?" News traveled fast in Grey Ridge. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Danny Morrison had confronted his cheating wife in the most public way possible. I texted back, "I'm fine, thanks for the heads up about tonight. Anytime. Erin's lucky to have someone who fights for her, even when she doesn't deserve it." I stared at that message for a long time, trying to figure out what Trish meant. Was she talking about my confrontation with Jackson or something else entirely? Around midnight, I heard Erin moving around upstairs, probably packing a bag. Part of me wanted to go up there and try to salvage what was left of our marriage. But a bigger part of me was tired of being the only one fighting for us. When I finally went to bed, she was curled up on her side of the mattress, as far away from me as possible. Her breathing was too controlled to be natural. She was awake, probably waiting for me to say something. But I had nothing left to say. Saturday morning, I woke up alone. Erin's car was gone from the driveway, and there was a note on the kitchen table written in her careful handwriting. "Danny, I'm staying at Trish's for a while. We both need time to think about what we want. I'm sorry about everything. E." I crumpled up the note and threw it in the trash, then made coffee and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. The phone rang at 9 o'clock. It was Pete Kowalski, one of my shift supervisors. "Danny, you need to get down here. We've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves spray paint and broken windows." I was at the mine in 20 minutes, surveying the damage to my office trailer. Someone had painted "Monster" across the side in red letters 3 feet tall. Every window was shattered, and the front door hung open on broken hinges. "Security cameras catch anything?" I asked. Pete shook his head. Whoever did this knew exactly where the blind spots were. Inside the trailer, my office had been systematically destroyed. Files were scattered across the floor, my computer monitor was smashed, and someone had poured motor oil all over my desk. But the real message was written on the wall behind my chair in the same red paint. "Tainted money won't save you. Any idea who might have done this?" Pete asked. I had several ideas, but only one made sense. Jackson Price was sending me a message. This was far from over. "Call the sheriff," I said. I want this documented. You think they'll catch whoever did it? I looked around at the destruction of everything I'd built and felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. They won't have to, I said. I'll handle this myself. Pete gave me a worried look. Danny, maybe you should let the law is not going to protect what's mine, I interrupted, but I will. As I surveyed the wreckage of my office, I realized that Jackson Price had just made a serious mistake. He'd escalated this from a personal matter to a business one, and he'd chosen to play on my turf. He was about to learn why that was a very bad idea. The pit wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a converted warehouse on the wrong side of Gray Ridge with blacked-out windows and a single steel door marked Private Club. But inside, it was where men came to settle their differences the old-fashioned way. Big Joe had introduced me to the place 5 years ago, after a particularly bad day at the mine, when I'd needed to hit something that wouldn't file a lawsuit. The owner, an ex-Marine named Tommy Briggs, ran it like a military operation. Strict rules, no tools, and what happened in the pit stayed in the pit. It was exactly what I needed. You sure about this? Joe asked as we walked through the entrance. There's still time to handle this like civilized people. Jackson Price forfeited his right to civilized treatment when he vandalized my property, I replied. The main floor was a converted boxing gym with a regulation ring in the center and heavy bags hanging from the ceiling. But the real action happened downstairs in the basement where Tommy had set up an octagon cage and a sound system that could wake the dead. It was Saturday night, which meant the place was packed with miners, truckers, and other working-class guys looking to blow off steam. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and testosterone, and the crowd was already getting rowdy. Tommy spotted us from across the room and waved us over. Danny Morrison, he said, clasping my hand in a grip that could crack walnuts. Heard you've been having some domestic troubles. Word travels fast. Faster when it involves Jackson Price. That pretty boy's been running his mouth all over Morgantown, talking about how he's going to run you out of business. My jaw clenched. Is that so? Claims he's got connections in the state regulatory office. Says he can shut down your operation with a phone call. I felt the familiar burn of anger in my chest, but I kept my voice level. I'd like to discuss that with him personally. Tommy grinned, showing teeth that had been rearranged more than once. Funny you should mention that. Mr. Price is supposed to be here tonight. Someone told him you'd be looking for him. The setup was obvious, but I didn't care. Jackson wanted to play games? I'd give him a game he'd never forget. We made our way downstairs, where the crowd was even thicker and the noise was deafening. Two heavyweights were going at it in the cage, trading punches that sounded like sledgehammers hitting meat. There's your boy, Joe said, nodding toward the far corner. Jackson was holding court near the bar, surrounded by 3 guys I didn't recognize. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people made in a week, looking like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog. When he saw me, his face went pale, but he didn't back down. If anything, he puffed out his chest and took a step forward. Well, well, he said loudly enough for half the room to hear, if it isn't the Coal King himself. Come to apologize for that scene you made at the Lantern. The crowd around us started to take notice. Nothing drew attention like the promise of a good fight. Actually, I said, I came to discuss your redecorating skills. Nice work on my office. Jackson's smirk faltered for just a second. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Red paint, broken windows, threats written on the walls, very artistic. Sounds like you've got enemies, Morrison. Maybe you should examine your business practices. The crowd was getting bigger, sensing weakness in the water. Someone started chanting, fight, 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 and the energy in the room shifted from casual interest to predatory excitement. Here's what I think happened, I said, stepping closer to Jackson. You got embarrassed last night, so you decided to take it out on my property. Problem is, you picked the wrong man to mess with. You don't scare me, Jackson said, but his voice cracked slightly. I should. Tommy appeared beside us like a referee stepping into a boxing ring. Gentlemen, if you've got a dispute to settle, let's do it properly. Winner takes all, loser walks away and never comes back. Jackson looked around at the crowd of hostile faces surrounding him. These weren't his people, they were mine, coal miners and construction workers and truck drivers who'd known me for years and had no use for smooth-talking outsiders. This is insane, he said. You're the one who wanted to play hardball, I replied. Let's see what you're made of. The crowd erupted in cheers and started placing bets. Tommy cleared the cage and had us sign waivers that probably wouldn't hold up in court, but made everyone feel better about what was about to happen. Jackson's 3 friends tried to talk him out of it, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of so many people. He stripped off his polo shirt, revealing the soft physique of a man who got his exercise at an air-conditioned gym. I took off my work shirt and heard someone in the crowd whistle appreciatively. 20 years of hard labor had left me with the kind of muscle you can't get from lifting weights. Functional strength built from swinging sledgehammers and hauling coal. "Last chance to walk away," I said as we entered the cage. Jackson just glared at me and raised his fists. The fight lasted about 90 seconds. Jackson came at me swinging wildly, throwing haymakers that might have worked in a bar brawl but had no chance against someone who'd been in real fights. I slipped his first punch, absorbed the second on my shoulder, and then introduced him to the canvas with a right cross that started somewhere around my ankles. He went down hard and stayed down. The crowd exploded in cheers and started chanting my name. Tommy raised my hand like I just won the heavyweight championship of the world. Jackson's friends helped him to his feet and half carried him toward the exit. His face was already swelling, and I was pretty sure I'd broken his nose. "Remember our deal?" I called after him. "Winner takes all." He didn't look back. Later, as Joe and I sat at the bar, nursing beers and accepting congratulations from half the room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Satisfaction. "Feel better?" Joe asked. "Getting there. What's next?" I thought about that question as I watched Jackson's mess being mopped off the canvas. The physical confrontation had been satisfying, but it was just the beginning. Jackson had threatened my business, vandalized my property, and seduced my wife. One beating wasn't nearly enough payback for all of that. "Now the real fun starts," I said. Monday morning brought news that made my weekend victory taste even sweeter. Jackson Price had called in sick to work, citing a family emergency that would keep him out of the office for the rest of the week. Trish delivered the information over coffee at my kitchen table, her eyes bright with malicious glee. "Aaron's been trying to reach him since Saturday night," she said. "He's not answering his phone, not responding to texts." She's starting to panic. "Where is she now?" "Still at my place, but she's talking about driving to Morgantown to check on him." Trish stirred sugar into her coffee with unnecessary violence. "She thinks you might have done something to him." "Me? I was home all weekend, working in the garage. You can ask Joe. He stopped by Sunday afternoon to help me change the oil in my truck." It was a carefully constructed alibi, and Joe would back me up without question. Not that I expected any legal trouble from our encounter at the pit. What happened there stayed there, and Jackson was too proud to admit he'd been beaten by a coal miner in front of 50 witnesses. "What do you want me to tell her?" Trish asked. "The truth. Her boyfriend got scared and ran. Happens to a lot of men when they realize they're in over their heads." Trish nodded, but I could see something else in her expression. A calculating look that made me wonder what game she was really playing. "Danny," she said carefully, "what if I told you there was more to this than just the affair?" "What do you mean?" She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos until she found what she was looking for. "I took this at Maddie's birthday party, before I knew about Jackson." The photo showed Aaron, Maddie, and a third woman I didn't recognize, all of them laughing over drinks at some upscale restaurant. "So, look at the background." I studied the image more carefully and felt my blood pressure spike. In the background, partially obscured by other diners, Jackson was sitting at a table with 2 men in expensive suits. One of them was Harold Brennan, a state regulatory official I dealt with during the safety inspection. "When was this taken?" 3 weeks before your mine got inspected." The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about a coordinated effort to destroy my business. Jackson hadn't just been sleeping with my wife. He'd been using her to gather intelligence for what looked like a much bigger operation. "Who's the third man?" I asked. "I don't know, but Maddie might. She knows everyone in the state capitol." I studied the photo again, memorizing every detail. If Jackson thought he could use my wife to take down my business, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating coal miners. "I need you to do something for me," I said. "Name it. Set up a meeting with Maddie. Tell her you're worried about Aaron, and you want to understand what's really going on." Trish's eyes lit up with anticipation. "You think Maddie's involved in this?" "I think Maddie likes to be the center of attention, and she's probably been bragging about her connections to anyone who'll listen." "What about Aaron?" Let her stew for a while. When Jackson doesn't surface by the end of the week, she'll be desperate enough to make mistakes. After Trish left, I spent the morning making phone calls and pulling strings I hadn't used in years. The coal business might be dying, but it still had enough political influence to make life difficult for people who crossed the wrong lines. By noon, I had Harold Brennan's employment history, his financial records, and a list of every inspection he'd conducted in the past 2 years. The pattern that emerged was interesting. Brennan had a habit of targeting small, family-owned operations with suspiciously well-informed complaints. My phone rang just as I was finishing my research. "Danny, it's Pete. We've got another problem." "What now?" "Someone called in an anonymous tip about safety violations. State inspector's on his way." I felt a cold smile spread across my face. "Which inspector?" "Harold Brennan." "Perfect. Make sure everything's in perfect order when he gets there. And Pete, make sure you mention that we've installed those new ventilation systems I've been talking about." "We haven't installed any new ventilation systems." "We will have by the time Brennan gets here. Call Murphy's Industrial Supply and tell them it's an emergency. I don't care what it costs." I spent the rest of the day overseeing the installation of equipment that should have been put in months ago, but that wasn't the point. The point was showing Harold Brennan that his little game was over. When Brennan arrived Wednesday morning, he found a mining operation that exceeded every safety standard by a comfortable margin. He spent 3 hours looking for violations that didn't exist, growing more frustrated by the minute. Finally, I invited him into my newly repaired office for a private conversation. "Disappointing inspection?" I asked, settling behind my desk. Brennan was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who looked like he'd never done a day of manual labor in his life. "Your operation appears to be in compliance." "Appears to be? Harold, we're so far above compliance, we could probably qualify for a safety award." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Yes, well, that's good to hear." "I was surprised to get another inspection so soon after the last one," I continued, "especially based on an anonymous tip. Those can be unreliable. We investigate all complaints thoroughly." "Of course you do. Speaking of complaints, I've been looking into some of your other inspections. Interesting pattern. A lot of small operators getting hit with expensive violations based on anonymous tips." Brennan's face went pale. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Harold. I'm stating facts." I leaned forward and fixed him with a stare that had intimidated better men than him. "The question is whether you want to discuss those facts here, or whether you'd prefer to explain them to the State Ethics Committee." The silence stretched out for nearly a minute before Brennan finally spoke. "What do you want?" "I want to know who's been feeding you information about my operation. I want to know who paid you to target small mining companies, and I want to know what Jackson Price promised you in exchange for your cooperation." Brennan's shoulders sagged in defeat. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. Jackson said he was just trying to force some safety improvements. "And the money? What money?" I pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "Bank records, Harold. Deposits that correspond exactly with the dates of your inspections. Someone's been paying you very well for your services." Brennan stared at the documents like they might burst into flames. "How did you get these?" "I've got friends in low places. Now start talking." What he told me over the next hour was even worse than I'd suspected. Jackson Price wasn't just some lovesick fool trying to impress my wife. He was part of a larger operation designed to drive small mining companies out of business and consolidate the industry under a few major players. Erin hadn't just been cheating on me. She'd been an unwitting accomplice in a conspiracy that could have destroyed dozens of family businesses and put hundreds of people out of work. By the time Brennan left my office, he was a broken man who'd agreed to cooperate fully with any investigation in exchange for my promise not to destroy his career immediately. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Jackson Price had made this personal when he seduced my wife. He'd made it business when he tried to destroy my operation. Now it was time to show him what happened when you declared war on a coal miner who'd spent his whole life fighting for everything he had. The Gray Ridge Town Hall hadn't seen a crowd this big since the mine explosion of 1907. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls, all of them buzzing with anticipation about what Danny Morrison might say at the monthly town council meeting. I'd requested time on the agenda to discuss community safety concerns, which was vague enough to pique everyone's curiosity but specific enough to get me 15 minutes at the podium. What they didn't know is that I was about to blow the lid off the biggest scandal Gray Ridge had seen in decades. Erin sat in the third row, flanked by Trish and Maddie. She'd been trying to reach me all week, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that I'd ignored. Jackson was still missing, and she was finally starting to understand that her perfect plan was falling apart. Mayor Patricia Hendricks called the meeting to order and worked through the usual business: budget reports, zoning requests, complaints about potholes, before finally introducing me. Danny Morrison has requested time to address the council about community safety concerns, she announced. Danny? I walked to the podium and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. These were my people, miners and their families, small business owners, retirees who'd spent their whole lives in Grey Ridge. They deserved to know what had been done to them. Thank you, Mayor Hendricks. I'm here tonight to talk about a conspiracy that's been operating right under our noses, targeting our businesses and threatening our way of life. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't what they'd been expecting. 3 months ago, my mining operation was hit with a surprise safety inspection that cost us $30,000 and 2 weeks of production. The inspector claimed he'd received an anonymous tip about violations. I clicked a remote and the first slide appeared on the projection screen behind me, a photo of Harold Brennan accepting an envelope from Jackson Price. That inspector was Harold Brennan, and the tip wasn't anonymous. It came from Jackson Price, a logistics coordinator who's been running a scheme to drive small mining operations out of business. The murmur became a roar. I waited for it to die down before continuing. Mr. Price has been using inside information to target family-owned businesses throughout the region. He bribes inspectors, manufactures violations, and then offers to buy the struggling companies at below-market prices. Another slide. Bank records showing payments from a shell company registered to Jackson Price to Harold Brennan and 2 other state inspectors. In the past 2 years, this operation has forced 11 small mining companies into bankruptcy. Hundreds of jobs have been lost. Millions of dollars in family wealth have been stolen. The crowd was getting angry now. I could see faces flushing red, hands clenching into fists. But Mr. Price made a mistake when he targeted Grey Ridge. He thought he could seduce one of our own into helping him destroy our community. I clicked to the next slide, a photo of Erin and Jackson at the restaurant, clearly intimate and conspiratorial. Erin gasped and half rose from her seat. Trish grabbed her arm and pulled her back down, but the damage was done. Everyone in the room had seen the photo, and they all knew what it meant. My wife, Erin Morrison, has been having an affair with Jackson Price for the past 6 months. During that time, she provided him with detailed information about my business operations, safety procedures, and financial records. The room erupted. People were shouting, standing up, pointing at Erin. She was crying now, her face buried in her hands. I don't blame my wife for falling for a smooth-talking con man, I continued, raising my voice to be heard over the chaos. Jackson Price is a professional manipulator who preys on vulnerable people. But I do blame him for using her feelings to attack our community. Mayor Hendricks was banging her gavel, trying to restore order. Mr. Morrison, these are very serious accusations. They're not accusations, Mayor. They're facts backed up by evidence that I've already turned over to the State Attorney General's office. That got everyone's attention. The room fell silent. Harold Brennan has agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for leniency. We have bank records, recorded phone conversations, and photographic evidence of the entire operation. I clicked to the final slide, a mugshot of Jackson Price from his arrest that morning on charges of conspiracy, bribery, and fraud. Jackson Price was arrested at 6 a.m. today at his apartment in Morgantown. He's being held without bail pending trial. The other conspirators will be arrested within the week. The silence stretched out for nearly a minute before someone in the back started clapping. Then someone else joined in, and within seconds the entire room was on its feet, applauding and cheering. I stood at the podium and soaked it in. The vindication, the satisfaction, the sweet taste of justice served cold. When the applause finally died down, I leaned into the microphone for my closing statement. Jackson Price thought he could come into our town and take what didn't belong to him. He thought we were just a bunch of dumb coal miners who wouldn't fight back. He was wrong. I looked directly at Erin, who was staring at me with a mixture of horror and something that might have been admiration. In Grey Ridge, we protect what's ours. We stand up for our neighbors, and we don't let outsiders destroy what we've built with our own hands. I stepped away from the podium to another round of thunderous applause. As I walked back to my seat, people reached out to shake my hand, pat my back, and offer their congratulations. But I wasn't done yet. After the meeting, as people filed out into the parking lot, still buzzing with excitement, I found Maddie standing by her car looking like she'd seen a ghost. "Quite a show in there," she said. "Just getting started," I replied. "We need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's a great idea, especially since you're the one who introduced Jackson to my wife in the first place." Maddie's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. You've been working with Jackson for months, identifying potential targets and setting up the seductions. Erin wasn't his first victim, was she?" The silence was answer enough. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to turn yourself into the State Attorney General's office tomorrow morning. You're going to tell them everything you know about Jackson's operation, and you're going to pray that your cooperation is enough to keep you out of prison." "And if I don't?" I smiled, and she took a step backward. "Then I'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what you've been doing, how you've been destroying families and communities for money, how you convinced my wife to betray her own husband." Maddie was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streams. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. "It never is," I replied, "but it did." I left her standing in the parking lot and walked to my truck, where Trish was waiting for me. "That was incredible," she said. "You destroyed them. They destroyed themselves. I just made sure everyone knew about it. What about Erin?" I looked back at the town hall, where my wife was still sitting in her seat, staring at nothing. "What about her? Are you going to take her back?" I thought about that question as I started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot. 3 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Erin had been the center of my world for 20 years. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't trust. "Some things can't be fixed," I said finally. As we drove through the quiet streets of Grey Ridge, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Jackson Price was in jail, his conspiracy was exposed, and my reputation was not only intact but stronger than ever. The coal business might be dying, but Grey Ridge would survive. We always had, and so would I.